The bank manager did not say a single word when he turned that screen toward me. He did not need to. I sat there in that leather chair across from his desk on a perfectly ordinary Monday morning in October, wearing my good gray coat, the wool one I always saved for appointments that required a certain dignity, and I watched the numbers on that screen rearrange every assumption I had ever made about my own life. The fluorescent light above us hummed. Somewhere outside on Pierce Street, I could hear a delivery van reversing, that mechanical beeping cutting through the glass, and a seagull calling out over the harbor the way they always do in Kinsale when the tide is coming in. Ordinary sounds. Perfectly ordinary sounds on a perfectly ordinary morning. And yet nothing about that moment was ordinary at all. I am Eleanor Whitmore. I am 76 years old. I spent 34 years of my working life as a chartered accountant. And I say that not to impress anyone, but simply because it matters to what I am about to tell you. Numbers were my language. They were the thing I understood before I understood almost anything else. My late husband Desmond used to say I could read a balance sheet the way other women read poetry, with genuine feeling, with an instinct for what was hidden beneath the surface. He meant it as a compliment, and I always took it as one. So when that bank manager, a careful, soft-spoken young man named Ronan Kelleher, who had managed my accounts for nearly 6 years, when he turned that monitor toward me with the expression of someone delivering a diagnosis they had been rehearsing all morning, I did not look away. I looked directly at the screen. That was my training. You look at the numbers. You look at the numbers, no matter what they say. 8 months of transactions. 43 separate withdrawals. Each one authorized through the online portal I used perhaps once a month to pay quarterly bills or check my investment summary. The total figure at the bottom of the printed statement he slid across the desk to me was not something I will repeat here, because this is not a story about a number. But I will tell you that it represented the entirety of what I had set aside over more than 3 decades, the savings that were meant to see me comfortably through whatever years remained, the money I had never once touched impulsively, the retirement account I had built with the kind of quiet, patient discipline that does not make for exciting conversation at dinner parties, but does, eventually, make for a secure old age. Every withdrawal carried my digital authorization code. Every one of them. Ronan Kelleher folded his hands on the desk. He asked me, very gently, whether I had perhaps engaged a financial advisor to handle these transfers on my behalf, whether I had perhaps given someone access to my credentials, whether I remembered authorizing any of these transactions. I told him I had authorized none of them. He nodded slowly, as though he had suspected that answer and had been hoping to be wrong. I picked up that printed statement. I folded it once, very precisely, along the center line. I placed it inside my handbag. I thanked Ronan Kelleher for bringing it to my attention. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and walked out through the glass doors of the bank onto Pierce Street, where the October wind came off the harbor, cold and sharp, and entirely indifferent to what had just happened to me. I stood on the pavement for a moment. Just a moment. Then I walked home. I want you to understand something about that walk home, because I think it says something true about the way grief actually works. Not dramatic grief, not the kind that collapses in public or reaches for the telephone immediately or needs to announce itself. The quiet kind, the kind that finds you still placing one foot in front of the other up the hill toward Higher O'Connell Street, while your mind simply refuses to accept the arithmetic it has just been shown. I have lived in this stone townhouse on Higher O'Connell Street for 41 years. Desmond and I moved here when Graham was already grown, when we were past the stage of needing space for anyone but ourselves, and we chose it because of the light in the front room in the mornings, and because you could see a strip of the harbor from the upstairs window if you stood at a particular angle. We chose it because Kinsale felt like the kind of town that had seen enough history to know better than to make a fuss about ordinary things. There is something calming about living in a place with that quality. Something that tells you the town has endured worse than whatever you are presently carrying. I went inside. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table, and I unfolded that statement again. 43 transactions. I looked at the dates. I looked at the amounts. I looked at the timestamps on each digital authorization. Some of them had been processed in the middle of the night. Several had been split into slightly irregular amounts, not round numbers, not the kind of figures that would trigger an automatic fraud alert. Whoever had done this had known enough about financial monitoring systems to be deliberate about that. The amounts varied just enough to look organic, to look like the natural rhythm of a pensioner managing her own money in small, cautious increments. This was not impulsive. This was not reckless. This was planned. I have told this story enough times now, to solicitors, to investigators, eventually to a mediator, and now to you, that I know exactly where people expect me to break down. They expect it here. They expect me to tell you that I sat at that kitchen table and wept, that I picked up the telephone and called Graham, that I confronted someone immediately, demanded answers, shouted into the silence of the house. I did none of those things. I sat at that table until the tea went cold. Then I made a fresh pot. And I began to think. Because the thing about numbers, the thing Desmond always understood that I meant when I said they were my language, is that they do not just tell you what happened. If you know how to read them, they tell you how something happened. And if you are patient enough, careful enough, they begin to suggest who. I want to go back to the months before that October morning, because what happened at the bank did not arrive from nowhere. Looking back now, I can see the trail of it. Small things I had noticed and dismissed. Small moments I had not given the weight they deserved. Vanessa had been managing the family paperwork for almost 4 years by that point. She was Graham's wife, 47 years old, and she worked as an independent financial consultant, or had worked as one in the years before certain clients grew uncertain of her and certain projects went quiet in ways she never fully explained. I had liked Vanessa once. I want to be honest about that. She was sharp, she was organized, she had a particular kind of confidence that made you feel as though things were being handled. When Desmond became ill in his final year and the business of dying, and there is a great deal of business involved in dying, more than people expect, when all of that needed attending to, Vanessa had stepped in with a calm efficiency that I had genuinely needed. After Desmond was gone, it felt natural that she would continue. Graham suggested it, and I agreed. I was 69 years old, I was grieving, and I trusted my son. Those 3 facts together formed the conditions that made everything else possible. Vanessa handled the correspondence with my pension provider. She managed the renewal of my household insurance. She occasionally logged into my banking portal, with my knowledge, with my permission, using credentials I had shared during the period directly after Desmond's passing, when I had been too exhausted to manage everything myself. I had meant to reclaim sole access. I had mentioned it once or twice. It had never quite happened. Again, looking back, I can read what I failed to read at the time. The first thing I had noticed, and dismissed, was a conversation at Graham and Vanessa's house in Bandon Road the previous spring. I had been there for Sunday lunch, and I had found Vanessa in the kitchen when I arrived earlier than expected. She was on her phone, standing with her back to the door, and she ended the call very quickly when she heard me come in. That was all. She smiled, she asked about my drive, she poured me a glass of water. I thought nothing of it. The second thing, a letter from my pension provider that had been forwarded to me, already opened. Vanessa explained that it had been sent to her address by mistake, which was plausible because she had corresponded with them on my behalf. The letter contained nothing sensitive, or rather, it contained nothing sensitive that I could identify at the time. Only later would I understand that its contents had been useful to someone who needed to know exactly how much money I had and when it could be moved without triggering a review. The third thing, and this is the one that I come back to most often, because it was the moment I should have listened to whatever small instinct was already awake in me. The third thing was a phone call from Vanessa on a Thursday evening in August. She called to check in, as she sometimes did. We talked about nothing in particular for a few minutes. And then she laughed. I cannot explain why I remember that laugh now when I did not think of it again until October. It was not a cruel laugh. It was not directed at me. It was the laugh of someone who is releasing tension they have been carrying for a while. Loose, briefly unguarded, the kind of laugh that belongs to a private relief you have not meant to share. She caught it quickly, changed the subject, said she was tired and would ring again later in the week. She did ring again later in the week, and the week after that. And I had no reason, none that I could have named, to connect that laugh to anything at all. Until October. The days between that Monday morning at the bank and my first telephone call to a solicitor were 5 days. 5 days that I spent entirely alone in this house, which is not as sad as it sounds because I have always been capable of my own company, and because what I was doing during those 5 days was not brooding or weeping, but working. I have a study on the upper floor of this house, Desmond's old room originally, converted when he passed, though I kept his desk because it is a solid thing and I am fond of solid things. In that study, I keep my own records, paper records. I have always kept paper records alongside digital ones because I spent 34 years watching people believe that data was permanent and then watching it disappear. I keep a handwritten log of my major financial decisions. I keep printed summaries from each quarter. I keep correspondence in ringbinder files, organized by year, labeled in my own hand. Over those 5 days, I went through every file going back 4 years. I made my own ledger, column by column. Authorized transactions on one side, the bank statement on the other. I cross-referenced dates, amounts, correspondence. I traced the timeline of Vanessa's access to my credentials. I reconstructed, from memory and from archived emails, every request she had made on my behalf and every piece of documentation I had received, or not received, in response. By Thursday evening, I had a very clear picture. And the picture was more complicated than I had initially imagined. The money had not gone to Vanessa. Not directly. Not in the simple, legible way I had first assumed when I sat at that kitchen table on Monday with the cold tea and the folded statement. The transfers had moved through several accounts. Some of those accounts, I would later learn, had been opened using information that Vanessa held. But the money had not ended where she might have sent it if personal enrichment had been the simple motive. Portions of it had gone toward debt repayments, old debts, debts that predated her marriage to Graham by several years, debts connected to a business venture I had never been told about, connected to partners I had never met, connected to a period of Vanessa's professional life that she had apparently spent a great deal of energy making difficult to trace. But here is what I did not yet understand on that Thursday evening. Here is what I would not understand for several months more. Graham knew. Not all of it. Not the method. Not, I believe, the scale. But Graham knew there were debts. Graham knew money was needed, and Graham had chosen, very deliberately, to know nothing more than that. That was the thing that would cost me more sleep than the missing money ever did. On Friday morning, I telephoned a solicitor in Cork City. Not anyone connected to our family, not anyone Vanessa would know. A woman named Siobhan Dwyer, who had been recommended to me years ago by a colleague and whose name I had kept in my address book for the category of problems I had hoped never to have. I told her nothing specific on the telephone. I simply said I needed to meet with her at her earliest convenience. She said she could see me the following Tuesday. I said I would be there. I went downstairs, made tea, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden Desmond had planted in sections, methodically, over 20 years. The dahlias had gone over by October. The hydrangeas were browning at the edges. The old stone wall at the back was covered in the last of the season's ivy, which had gone a deep, burning red the way it always did when the weather turned. It is a strange thing to stand in a life you have built with tremendous care and to feel its architecture shift beneath you without any external sign that anything has changed at all. The garden looked exactly as it always did. The kitchen smelled of tea, and the particular old house warmth that stone walls hold even in autumn. The seagulls were still calling out over the harbor, and yet I was standing in an entirely different life than the one I had believed I inhabited the previous Friday. What I did not know yet, what none of my 5 days of careful reconstruction had revealed, was that the debt Vanessa had been hiding was only half the story. The other half was buried in a set of documents I had never been shown, connected to a property in Cork City I had never known existed, registered in a name I would not recognize until a specialist sat across from me in a consulting room and said it aloud. And when she did, everything I thought I understood about those 5 days of careful work shifted again. Because the name on that property was not Vanessa's. I have spent a great deal of my life in rooms where difficult information is delivered across a table. That is the nature of accounting work, when you do it honestly. You sit across from people and you show them what the numbers say, and sometimes what the numbers say is not what those people believed, and the space between their belief and the truth is where the most important conversations happen. I was good at those conversations. I was calm in them. I had learned, over 34 years, to let the information settle before I spoke, to give the person across from me the necessary moment to absorb what they had just been shown before I asked them anything. I had not expected to be the person on the receiving side of that table. Siobhan Dwyer's office was on the South Mall in Cork City, on the 3rd floor of a Georgian building with tall windows that let in the gray November light in long, flat sheets. She was a small woman, precise in the way that certain professionals become precise when they have spent decades being the calmest person in rooms full of distressed people. Her desk was not cluttered. Her questions were not theatrical. She listened to me for nearly 40 minutes without interrupting, and when I had finished laying out everything I had reconstructed in those 5 days of work at Desmond's old desk, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted to refer me to someone before we discussed next steps. That someone was a financial fraud specialist named Patricia Hogan. She worked from an office in Blackpool, not the English one, the Cork one, a part of the city that tourists rarely see, which suited the nature of her work perfectly well. Patricia Hogan was 53 years old, gray-haired, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck that she put on only when she was looking at documents and took off immediately afterward, as though the glasses were a tool to be deployed precisely and then returned to rest. I liked her within the first 10 minutes. She reminded me, in certain ways, of myself. It was Patricia who sat across from me in that consulting room 3 weeks after my first meeting with Siobhan and said the name I did not recognize. Donnelly Ford. She said it the way you might say a street name when giving directions, plainly, without emphasis, watching my face to see whether it landed on anything familiar. It landed on nothing. I told her I did not know anyone by that name. She nodded. She put on her glasses. She opened a folder and turned it toward me on the table. The property was a ground-floor commercial unit on Paul Street in Cork City. It had been registered under a holding company called Donnelly Ford Property Solutions. The company had 2 directors, a man named Ciaran Donnelly, a commercial property developer with a long history of leveraged projects and at least 2 dissolved companies behind him, and a second director who had been added to the register approximately 3.5 years ago. That second director was my son, Graham Whitmore. I looked at that page for a long time. Patricia Hogan did not speak. She understood, I think, the particular quality of silence that settles over a person who is not shocked. Because I was not shocked, not entirely. Not the way you are shocked by something you had no reason to imagine, but rather the silence of someone watching a suspicion they had been quietly refusing to name for several weeks finally arrange itself into a legible shape. Graham had not been a passive bystander who knew about debts in some vague, general sense. Graham had been an active director in a property venture that had borrowed heavily, defaulted partially, and spent the better part of 3 years managing its own collapse as discreetly as possible. The debts Vanessa had been covering, the debts that the money from my retirement account had been redirected toward, were not old debts from Vanessa's past that she had hidden from my son. They were debts connected to a business that Graham had co-founded and co-directed and co-mismanaged, and which neither of them had ever mentioned to me once in any conversation, in any form, across any of the Sunday lunches or telephone calls or quiet evenings in that kitchen on Bandon Road over the previous 4 years. Patricia Hogan let me finish reading before she spoke again. She told me that the transfers from my retirement account had been processed through a routing structure that was sophisticated enough to suggest professional assistance in its design. She told me that Vanessa's training as a financial consultant had provided the technical knowledge to execute it, but that the authorization codes had required access to my personal credentials, specifically the security tokens linked to my email address and my banking portal, that Vanessa had retained from the period directly after Desmond's death. She told me there was evidence that some of the transfers had been initiated during unusual hours. She told me the total amount diverted had been sufficient to clear a substantial portion of the principal debt on the Paul Street property, while leaving enough to cover 6 months of interest payments on a secondary loan. And then she told me something that I had not asked her yet, and that she had apparently been waiting to say. She told me the property had been sold 3 months prior to our meeting, quietly, through a private arrangement between Sierra and Donnelly and a buyer whose name appeared nowhere in public records. And from the proceeds of that sale, after the cleared debts were accounted for, a sum had been deposited into an account that Patricia had traced with some difficulty, but had traced nonetheless. The account was in my name. I stared at her. She said it again, more slowly, to make certain I had heard it correctly. An account in my name. A deposit I had not made, had not known existed, into an account I had not opened. I sat back in that chair in Patricia Hogan's office in Blackpool with the gray cork November pressing against the window, and I felt, for the first time since that Monday morning at the bank, something that was not grief and not anger, but something closer to vertigo. The sensation of a floor that has been moving beneath you so gradually that you have not noticed it moving until the moment it stops. The account had been opened at a different branch than my usual one. It had been opened using documentation I had not provided personally. It had been opened, Patricia believed, by Vanessa, not as a further act of theft, but as an act of what Patricia called, in her precise professional language, unauthorized restitution. Vanessa had been trying to return the money, not all of it, not yet. But she had begun, without telling Graham, without telling me, without telling Siobhan Dwyer or any solicitor or any mediator or anyone at all. She had opened an account in my name, and she had deposited into it the first portion of what had been taken, and she had apparently intended, though intention is a word that becomes very complicated when you are sitting across from a fraud specialist reading a report about your own financial life, she had apparently intended to continue until the balance was restored, after which she would have told me what she had done, all of it, the taking and the returning. I ask you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to. I had to sit with it for considerably longer than a moment, because the question that immediately followed, the question I could not avoid asking myself in the car on the drive back to Kinsale, in the kitchen that evening, in the study later that night, with Desmond's old desk lamp throwing a circle of warm light across the handwritten ledger I had been building for weeks. The question was whether what Vanessa had done constituted remorse, or whether it constituted something more calculated. Whether she had begun returning the money because she was genuinely sorry, or because she had anticipated discovery and was preparing a defense. Whether the account in my name was an act of conscience or an act of self-preservation. I did not know the answer. I told myself I did not need to know it yet. What I needed, Siobhan had told me at our second meeting, was documentation. Everything. Every record, every statement, every piece of correspondence. She needed to understand the full scope of what had happened before she could advise me on how to proceed, and she had been very clear that she did not want me to speak to Graham or to Vanessa until that picture was complete. I agreed to that. I followed her instruction. I am an accountant by training and a disciplined woman by temperament, and I understood that the impulse to confront someone directly, however natural, however justified, was precisely the impulse that tended to complicate the situations it was meant to resolve. But I will be honest with you and say that the discipline cost me. Those weeks were long ones. I continued my routine because routine is what I have always used to maintain the kind of clarity that difficult situations require. I walked down to the harbor in the mornings, a long silly walk where the water comes right up to the edge of the path and the fishing boats sit low in the tide. I had coffee at a place I had been going to for years on Market Square, where the woman behind the counter knew my order and never asked unnecessary questions, which I valued more than I can express during that period. I read in the evenings. I went to bed at the same hour. I did not sleep particularly well, but I was in the bed at the right time, which was the most I could manage. I rang Graham twice during those weeks. Ordinary calls. "How are you? How is the house? Have you heard the weather is turning?" He sounded exactly as he always sounded. Easy, slightly distracted, the way he had always been on the telephone since he was young, as though part of his attention was permanently directed somewhere else. I listened to him very carefully, and I heard nothing new, nothing that revealed whether he knew that Patricia Hogan existed or that Siobhan Dwyer had a file on her desk with his name in it. He did not know. I was fairly certain of that by the end of the second call, and that certainty produced a fresh complexity that I had not fully anticipated. If Graham did not know that I knew, and if Vanessa was conducting her quiet restitution without his knowledge, then what I had was not a conspiracy between two people who had acted together and were together managing the aftermath. What I had was two separate people carrying separate weights of the same secret, neither of them fully informed about what the other was doing. Which meant that when this came to light, and it would come to light because Siobhan was going to see to that, it would not arrive as a single revelation shared between a husband and wife who had prepared for it together. It would arrive as two separate shocks. And one of those shocks would land on someone who had participated in the original wrong, but who did not yet know the extent of the response that wrong had generated. I want to be clear about something here, because I think it is important. I did not feel sorry for Graham during those weeks. What I felt was something more considered, and in some ways more difficult than anger. I felt the particular disappointment of someone who has looked at a situation very carefully and recognized the precise moment when a different decision could have been made. Graham had known about those debts. He had known about the business on Paul Street and about Ciaran Donnelly and about the leveraged investment that had been quietly collapsing for the better part of 3 years. He had chosen not to tell me. He had allowed Vanessa to manage the crisis in whatever way she found available, and he had maintained a careful ignorance about the specific method she had chosen. That careful ignorance was not innocence. Desmond would have told me. That is the thought that kept returning during those long evenings at the desk. Desmond would have come to me with the problem before it became a crisis. He would have sat down at this table and said, "Eleanor, there is something I need to tell you, and it is not a comfortable thing to say." He would have found the words because he understood that honesty, however difficult, was always more recoverable than deception. Graham was not Desmond. I had always known that. I had tried, in the way of mothers, not to hold it against him. If any of this is sitting with you, if you have ever found yourself in the middle of a situation where the person you trusted most was also the person you loved most, and you could not yet separate those two facts, then you already know something about what the following months were going to ask of me. And I hope you will stay with me as I tell it, because the part that matters most is not the part you might expect. There is a quality to winter in Kinsale that people who have not lived here do not fully understand. It is not the cold, which is the same cold you find across Cork and across the south of Ireland generally. It is the light, or rather the quality of the dark around the light. The street lamps on Higher O'Connell Street come on early, and they cast a particular amber warmth that makes the wet stone of the buildings look almost golden, and you can stand at your own front door in the middle of December and feel, despite everything, that you are in a place that knows how to hold a person. I needed that in those months. Patricia's full report arrived in early January. It was 47 pages long, and I read it in a single sitting at Desmond's desk with the lamp on and a pot of tea that I let go cold without noticing. Every page confirmed something I had already suspected and added a detail I had not yet known, and by the time I reached the final summary, I had a complete picture. Perhaps the most complete picture of my own financial life I had ever had. More complete even than the picture I had maintained myself, because Patricia had found the connections between things that I had held separately and had not yet thought to join. There was one detail on page 31 that I had to read 3 times before I was certain I had understood it. A payment. Made 14 months before Patricia's investigation, from an account connected to Donnelly Ford Property Solutions. Made to a Cork City solicitor's firm that I did not recognize, for the preparation of a legal document. The document was described only in summary in Patricia's report, because she had not yet been able to obtain the full text. But the summary described it as a deed of arrangement, a private legal instrument outlining the responsibilities of multiple parties in relation to a shared financial obligation, signed by 2 individuals, Vanessa, and someone whose name I did not yet know, someone who was not Graham, someone who had been involved in this far longer than anyone in my family, and who had never once appeared in any conversation I had been part of, in any document I had been shown, in any version of events that had been offered to me since that Monday morning in October, when Ronan Kelleher turned the bank screen toward me and changed everything. I set down the report. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I picked up my telephone and sent Chauvin Dwyer a message asking for a meeting as soon as she was available. Because the story I had been reading for the past 3 months had just acquired a character I had not known existed, and until I knew who that person was, I realized I did not yet understand what had actually happened to my money, or why. There is a particular kind of cold that settles into stone houses in January. Not the cold of neglect. This house has always been well kept, well heated, well tended in the way that a woman who has lived alone for several years learns to tend things that matter to her. It is a different cold, the cold of walls that have absorbed decades of weather and hold it somewhere in their thickness, releasing it slowly through the night in a way that no amount of heating entirely defeats. Desmond used to say this house breathed, that on the coldest nights you could feel it exhaling. I thought that was a romantic notion when he first said it, which was something he was prone to, a romantic notion about an ordinary physical phenomenon. But I have lived here long enough now to think he was not entirely wrong. I woke at 4:30 on the morning after I finished reading Patricia's report. I did not try to go back to sleep. I put on my dressing gown and my slippers, and I went downstairs to the kitchen, and I stood at the window in the dark, looking out at the garden where nothing was visible except the faintest outline of the old stone wall and the amber reflection of the street lamp on the wet grass. I made tea. I stood there with the mug in both hands the way I have always held a mug when I am thinking rather than drinking, and I went back over page 31 in my mind. A deed of arrangement. 2 signatories. Vanessa. And someone unknown. I am an accountant. I have read thousands of legal instruments in my professional life. Deeds, contracts, letters of undertaking, financial agreements of every complexity. I know what a deed of arrangement is, and I know what it is used for. It is a formal binding document that outlines the obligations of parties in relation to a debt or a shared financial liability. It is used when the parties involved have reached a private agreement about how that liability will be managed, and it carries legal weight precisely because it is signed, witnessed, and filed with a solicitor's firm. The existence of that deed told me several things. It told me that Vanessa had not acted impulsively. Whatever she had done with my money, she had not done it in a moment of panic or desperation. She had done it within a framework. There was a structure to it, a structure that had been drawn up by a solicitor and agreed to by at least 2 people, one of whom I did not know. It told me that Ciaran Donnelly was not simply a business partner of my son's who had drifted away when the venture failed. He was, or someone connected to him was, still present in the arrangements that had been made around the debt. And it told me, and this was the thing that kept me standing at that kitchen window in the dark at 4:30 in the morning with cold tea and a garden I could not see. It told me that there was an entire dimension of this situation that had been deliberately kept from me. Not just the debt, not just the transfers, but the existence of a formal legal agreement about both of those things made by people who knew me in a solicitor's office in Cork City, at a time when I had been sitting in this house believing that the most complicated thing in my life was the dahlias not coming up as well as I had hoped. Siobhan Dwyer met me 4 days later. She had obtained, through the appropriate legal channels, a copy of the deed. It was 11 pages long. The solicitor's firm was one she recognized, a mid-sized practice in the city with a mixed commercial and personal client base. Not the firm she would have expected for this kind of arrangement, which told her something about how the parties had chosen it. Not a specialist. Not someone who would ask too many questions. She read through the key provisions with me, carefully, in that precise way she had of making certain that each element was fully understood before she moved to the next. The deed had been drawn up between Vanessa, acting in her own name, and a woman named Aoife Kearney. I did not recognize the name immediately. Siobhan watched my face when she said it, and I could tell she was noting the absence of recognition, which she had apparently anticipated. She told me that Aoife Kearney was 51 years old, that she had been a business partner of Ciaran Donnelly's before the Paul Street venture, a prior arrangement, a different property, an earlier project that had also ended in dispute and dissolution. That she had brought a legal claim against Donnelly in connection with that earlier project and had settled it privately approximately 5 years ago. And that she had, in the intervening years, maintained what Patricia's investigation had described as an informal advisory relationship with Ciaran Donnelly's subsequent business interests, including, it appeared, the Paul Street company in which my son had become a director. The deed between Vanessa and Aoife Kearney was, in essence, an agreement about silence. Vanessa had agreed to satisfy a specific portion of the outstanding debt connected to Paul Street, a portion owed not to a bank or a formal lender, but to Aoife Kearney personally, who had apparently provided private financing to the venture at some point and was owed a sum that had never been formally declared in the company's documentation. In return, Aoife Kearney had agreed not to pursue any further claims, not against the company, not against Ciaran Donnelly, and not against Graham. Vanessa had protected my son, at my expense. I sat with that for a very long time in Siobhan's office on the South Mall, with the January light flat and pale through those tall Georgian windows. The South Mall on a January afternoon is a quiet street. The trees are bare, the traffic is minimal. It has the quality of a place that is resting, gathering itself, waiting for something that has not yet arrived. I found that quality useful in that moment. It matched something in me. Siobhan did not press me to respond. She was good at that, at understanding that certain information needed a particular interval of silence before any productive conversation could follow it. She poured water from the carafe on her desk and pushed the glass gently toward me and waited. I thought about Vanessa. I thought about the woman I had watched at Sunday lunches for the better part of 12 years, composed, capable, sometimes brittle in the way that very capable people can become brittle when they believe no one around them is working as hard as they are. I had never found Vanessa entirely easy. There had always been a quality of management in how she approached things, including how she approached me. I was a component of her life that she handled well, that she handled with competence and even with a certain warmth, but that she handled nonetheless. I had felt it and had never said it because she was Graham's wife, and she was efficient, and she had been kind to Desmond at the end, and those things counted for something. But I had never imagined this, not because I thought her incapable of a difficult decision. I did not think that. I had always understood that Vanessa was someone who made decisions and lived with them. But because I had not understood, until that moment in Siobhan's office, the full weight of what she had been carrying. The debt, the threat from Eowaif Kearney, the knowledge that Graham's name on a company directorship could become enormously damaging if Kearney chose to pursue her claims publicly. The need to resolve all of it quietly, quickly, and without my son knowing the specific mechanism by which it had been resolved. Vanessa had made a calculation, a terrible one, a wrong one, a calculation that had no legal or moral justification. But it had been a calculation made in service of protecting something, not herself, or not only herself, but Graham. And however wrong it had been, that motive sat differently in me than pure greed would have. I told Siobhan that I needed to understand one more thing before I could decide how to proceed. I told her I needed to know whether Graham had known about Eowaif Kearney. She said she could not answer that yet. But she was working on it. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this is the part of the story where it becomes easy to make assumptions about guilt, about innocence, about who deserves what and in what measure. I have told this story to enough people now to know that most of them, at this point, have already formed a position. Some of them are angry on my behalf, which I understand. Some of them have begun to feel something more complicated, a reluctant sympathy for Vanessa that sits uncomfortably alongside the knowledge of what she did. A few of them have asked about Graham in a tone that suggests they are not yet certain where to place him. That uncertainty is correct. Hold on to it. It is doing important work. If this story is doing what I hope it is doing, if it is making you think about the people in your own life who love you imperfectly, who make wrong decisions for reasons that are not entirely wrong, then I hope you will stay with me through the rest of it. And if you haven't already, this would be a good moment to subscribe to this channel, because what comes next changes the shape of everything I have told you so far, and I would not want you to miss it when it arrives. The February that followed was the quietest month of my life. Not quiet in the way of peace, but quiet in the way of suspension. The particular stillness of a situation that has been fully examined and not yet resolved, where every party is in position and no one has yet moved. Siobhan was working. Patricia had submitted a supplementary report covering Eowaif Kearney's financial history and the structure of the private loan she had extended to the Paul Street Company. Graham continued to ring on Thursdays in his usual distracted fashion, and I continued to receive those calls in this kitchen and to speak to him about nothing that mattered. Vanessa did not ring during February. That was new. She had always rung, with a regularity that I had not noticed as regularity until it stopped. Not frequently, not warmly exactly, but consistently. A call every 2 or 3 weeks, a brief check-in that discharged her sense of obligation toward me without requiring very much of either of us. The absence of those calls in February told me something. It told me she was either afraid or she was preparing. Possibly both. I walked more than usual during those weeks. Kinsale in February is not a hospitable place for walking, but it is an honest one. The harbor sits low and gray, and the boats move on it with the kind of slow purpose that has nothing to do with tourism and everything to do with the actual business of the sea. I walked along Silly Walk in the mornings with the wind coming off the water, and I let myself think about Desmond, which I do not permit myself to do in an unstructured way very often, because I find grief, when it is not contained, tends to diffuse through everything and make clear thinking more difficult. But in February, I let myself think about him. I thought about the fact that he had known Ciaran Donnelly. Not well. They had been connected through a community development committee years ago, the kind of civic involvement that Desmond had always taken seriously, and that I had always admired in him without fully sharing it. They had sat on a committee together for perhaps 2 years, and then Donnelly had moved on to other things, and Desmond had mentioned his name perhaps twice more in subsequent years. Once in connection with a planning application in the city, and once in connection with something I had not paid close attention to at the time. I had not paid close attention. I sat with that too. Because here is the thing about reconstructing the past. The real past, not the simplified version that grief and time and the ordinary business of living tend to produce. The real past is always more connected than you remember. The people in it are always more entangled. The threads that link them were always there. You simply did not follow them because there was no reason to, because lives are lived forward and not backward, and you cannot investigate every casual acquaintance as though they might one day become relevant to a fraud case. But they were there. Desmond had known Donnelly. Donnelly had later become connected to Graham. And somewhere in that chain of connection, in the years between a civic committee and a dissolved property company, something had gone wrong in a way that had eventually found its way to my retirement account and to a printed bank statement on a desk in Ronan Kelleher's office. I am not suggesting conspiracy. I want to be clear about that. I am not suggesting that any of this was planned from some distant starting point with me as a deliberate target. Life is rarely organized enough for that kind of architecture. What I am suggesting is that the world is smaller than we believe it to be, and that the people connected to us are connected to each other in ways we do not always see, and that those invisible connections can, under the right pressure, produce consequences that no single person designed, but that every person involved helped to build. In the third week of February, Siobhan rang me on a Tuesday evening. She had found something. Not through Patricia this time. Through a different channel, a contact she had in the Cork legal community, who had, without disclosing anything that violated professional confidence, confirmed something that Siobhan had been working to establish for several weeks. Graham had met Aoife Kearney once, one meeting, approximately 20 months before my Monday morning at the bank. A meeting that had taken place not in Cork City, but in a hotel in Cove, which is far enough from Kinsale and far enough from Graham and Vanessa's house in Bandon Road to be noticeable as a choice of location. Siobhan did not know what had been discussed. She did not know who had arranged the meeting or what had followed from it. She knew only that it had occurred, that both parties had been present, and that no record of it appeared anywhere in the documentation that Graham had been connected to, professionally or personally, in the months that followed. One meeting in a hotel in Cove, with a woman whose name I had not heard until 4 days ago, a meeting that Graham had never mentioned. I asked Siobhan what she thought it meant. She was quiet for a moment in the way that careful people are quiet when they have a view they want to express precisely. She said she thought it meant that Graham's knowledge of the situation was probably not as limited as he had allowed it to appear. She said she thought the nature of that meeting, its location, its apparent absence from any record, suggested that Graham had known about Aoife Kearney's involvement before Vanessa entered into the deed of arrangement, that he had perhaps known about the private loan, that his decision to remain ignorant of the specific method by which the debt was being resolved had been a more informed decision than the word ignorant usually implied. He had known enough. He had chosen to know no more, and he had let his wife carry the mechanism of it alone. I ended the call. I sat in the study with the lamp on. Outside, the February rain was moving in from the sea in the particular diagonal sheets that Cork rain favors, and the street lamp on Higher O'Connell Street was doing what it always does, throwing that amber warmth across the wet stone, making the ordinary world look briefly, improbably, like something worth staying in. I thought about what Siobhan had told me, and then, very carefully, very deliberately, I began to think about what I wanted. Not what the law allowed, not what the evidence supported, not what justice, in the abstract, might require. What I, Eleanor Whitmore, 76 years old, 41 years in this house, wanted from the remaining portion of my life. That question, I realized, was the one I had not yet asked myself. I had been so focused on understanding what had happened that I had not turned far enough toward the question of what I intended to do with what I had come to understand. Siobhan had told me, in our very first meeting, that I had options. Legal options, civil remedies, formal complaints to the relevant financial regulatory bodies. She had outlined them with her usual precision, and I had listened with my usual attention, and I had filed them in my mind as the available landscape, the terrain across which whatever came next would have to move. But options are not the same as intentions, and I was beginning to understand that my intentions were more complicated than my options, and that the most important conversation I had not yet had was not with Siobhan Dwyer or Patricia Hogan or Ronan Kelleher or anyone in a professional capacity. It was a conversation I needed to have with myself, alone, in this house, with sufficient time and sufficient honesty to arrive at something I could actually live with. I gave myself 1 week, 7 days to think, to walk, to sit at Desmond's desk in the evenings and write in the notebook I had been keeping since October. Not a ledger this time, not columns and cross-references and reconstructed timelines, but something closer to the kind of writing I had not done since I was a young woman who occasionally had thoughts that needed to go somewhere outside her own head. On the 7th day, I walked down to the harbor in the morning. It was the last day of February. The rain had stopped overnight, and the air had that particular washed clarity that follows Cork rain, sharp and cold and absolutely transparent, the kind of air that makes distances look closer than they are and colors more saturated than they have any right to be in winter. The boats on the harbor were very still. The water was the color of old pewter. A single heron stood on the stone steps of the quay with the absolute composure that herons always manage and that I have always found instructive. I stood there for a long time, and by the time I walked back up the hill toward Higher O'Connell Street, I knew what I was going to do. Not the detail of it, not the mechanism. That would be Siobhan's work and Patricia's work and the work of the weeks and months ahead, but the principle of it, the direction. I was not going to pursue criminal charges. I was not going to destroy what remained of my family for the satisfaction of a verdict that would give me nothing I actually needed. What I was going to do was far more difficult, and what made it difficult was not what you might expect. It was not the forgiveness, or the legal complexity, or the question of the money. What made it difficult was a single detail that Siobhan had not mentioned, but that had been sitting in the back of my mind since I read page 31 of Patricia's report and had not yet allowed itself to fully surface. The deed between Vanessa and Eoife Kearney had been signed 14 months before my Monday morning at the bank, which meant that the money had been taken after the agreement had already been made, which meant that at the moment Vanessa signed that deed, committing herself to satisfying Kearney's claim. She had not yet had the means to do it. She had signed the deed first. Then she had found the money, and the only place the money had been available, in the right amount, at the right time, with the right access already in place, was mine. That was not a decision made in crisis. That was a decision made in sequence. And understanding that sequence meant understanding something about Vanessa that changed, very subtly but very permanently, what I had been beginning to feel toward her. Not back to anger, not to the simpler version of this story where a guilty party is clearly guilty and an innocent party is clearly innocent, and everything resolves itself along those clean lines. Something more difficult than that. Something I was going to have to carry with me into every conversation that followed, including the one I could already sense was coming. The one I had not yet initiated. The one that could not be conducted through solicitors or mediation or any formal process, but only between two women, alone, in a room without the protection of professional language or legal framework. That conversation was still months away, but I could feel it approaching the way you feel weather approaching in this part of Ireland. Not a sudden arrival, but a gradual shift in the quality of the air, a change in pressure, the particular stillness that precedes something large moving toward you across open water. I went inside, I made tea, I opened the notebook, and I began for the first time to write not about what had been taken from me, but about what I intended to keep. Siobhan Dwyer had a habit of beginning difficult meetings with tea, not as a social ritual, she was not a particularly ceremonial woman, but as a practical one. She had told me once, early in our work together, that she had learned over the course of her career that people who were holding a great deal of tension in their bodies needed something to do with their hands before they could think clearly, and that a cup of tea solved that problem more efficiently than almost anything else she had tried. I had appreciated that observation. It was the kind of practical psychology that comes not from training, but from years of sitting across from people in the middle of the worst situations of their lives. The meeting in March, the one I had requested after my 7 days of walking and writing and standing at the harbor, watching the heron conduct its business with that magnificent indifference, that meeting began with tea. I told Chauvin what I had decided. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. She let me finish. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both of them precise and practical, about the scope of what I was proposing and the timeline I had in mind. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance somewhere above my left shoulder, in the way she did when she was organizing her thoughts into the most useful sequence. Then she said she had worked with many clients over many years, and that in her experience, the decisions that looked like weakness from the outside were very frequently the ones that required the most courage from the inside. She said she would support whatever I chose, and that it was her job to make certain that whatever I chose was executed properly, legally, and in a way that protected me, not just financially, but in every sense of the word. I told her I was not interested in being protected. I was interested in being finished. She understood what I meant by that. I could see it in the slight adjustment of her expression, not a smile exactly, but the particular quality of attention that a person gives you when you have said something that corresponds precisely with something they already believed about you. We began the process that same week. What Chauvin proposed was a structured mediation, not a court proceeding, not yet, and in the end, not ever. A formal, legally binding mediation process conducted through an independent mediator in Cork City, with all relevant parties present and all relevant documentation disclosed. The purpose was not to assign criminal culpability. That was a separate matter, one that would remain available to me if the mediation failed, but to establish a full accounting of what had happened, a formal acknowledgement from everyone involved, and a legally enforceable agreement about restitution. She had used this approach before, in situations that had certain structural similarities to mine. She said it was slower than litigation and quieter than prosecution, but that for a family situation, for a situation where the wrongdoing was serious but the relationships were not, in her view, beyond recovery, it tended to produce outcomes that people could actually live with, as opposed to outcomes that were legally satisfying but personally devastating. I told her that was precisely the distinction I had been trying to articulate during my 7 days by the harbor. She said she thought it probably was. The letters went out in the 3rd week of March. 1 to Graham, 1 to Vanessa, 1 to the solicitor's firm that had prepared the deed of arrangement, requiring disclosure of the full document under the legal grounds Chauvin had identified. A separate notification to Ove Kearney's last known address, informing her that the matters outlined in the deed of arrangement were now subject to a formal mediation process and that her participation, while not compulsory, was strongly advised. I was not present when Graham received his letter. I do not know exactly what he did when he read it. I have thought about that moment many times since. The specific quality of the silence that must have followed, the particular way a person sits very still when a thing they have been expecting, without admitting they were expecting it, finally arrives in an envelope on an ordinary morning. I have thought about whether he rang Vanessa immediately, or whether he sat with it alone first. Whether he was angry or whether he was, beneath the anger, something closer to relieved. He rang me that evening. He did not shout. That surprised me. And then it did not surprise me, because Graham had never been a person who shouted. His emotional register had always operated at a lower frequency than that, a compression rather than an explosion, a tightening rather than a release. He said my name when I answered. Then he said he had received Chauvin Dwyer's letter. Then he was quiet for a long moment that I did not fill. Then he said very quietly, I am sorry, Mum. 3 words. I had spent 5 months and 47 pages of forensic reporting and a 7-day retreat to the harbor and a notebook full of the most honest writing I had done in years, all of it moving toward this telephone call and these 3 words. And I sat in this kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I thought, that is not enough. And I also thought, it is a beginning. And I held both of those thoughts at the same time, which is not a comfortable thing to do, but which I have come to believe is the only honest thing. I told him we would speak properly at the mediation. He said he understood. I said good night, and I ended the call, and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the quiet of this house, with the sound of the harbor below the hill and the street lamp doing what it always does to the stone outside, and I let myself feel, for the first time since October, something that was not grief or anger or the disciplined suspension of both, but something closer, only slightly closer but closer, to the ordinary texture of being alive. The mediation took place over 3 sessions across April and May. I will not give you the full architecture of those sessions here, because some of what was said in those rooms was said in the particular confidence of a process designed for honesty rather than record, and I have always believed that certain conversations belong to the people who had them. What I will tell you is the shape of it. The emotional shape, which is the only shape that matters in the end. The first session was the hardest. Vanessa sat across from me for the first time since the previous summer. She had lost weight. Her hair, which she had always maintained with the kind of careful attention that telegraphed a certain relationship with control, was less precisely kept than I remembered it. She sat very straight, which I recognized as the posture of someone who is using their spine to do the work that their composure can no longer do alone. She did not look at me when she came in. She looked at the mediator, a calm and experienced man named Declan Ford from Cork City, and she placed her hands on the table in front of her, and she kept them there, very still, for the entire opening portion of the session. I watched her. I did not feel what I had expected to feel, which is perhaps the most honest thing I can tell you about that morning. I had prepared myself for anger, the specific, clean anger that I had kept carefully managed for 5 months, and that I had assumed would arrive with full force the moment I was in the same room as the person who had authorized 43 transfers out of my retirement account. I had expected it, and I had decided to allow it, and I had told Siobhan that I intended to feel it, and then set it aside. It did not arrive. What arrived instead was something I can only describe as recognition. The recognition you feel when you look at a person who is sitting with the full weight of what they have done and who is not performing remorse, but genuinely inhabiting it. It is a specific quality. You cannot manufacture it, and you cannot mistake it for something else once you have seen it, because it does not look like what people imagine guilt looks like. It does not look dramatic or demonstrative. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and who has finally, in this room, set it down and is only now feeling the full measure of what that weight has done to them. Vanessa had been carrying this for 14 months before I found out. 14 months of managing the mechanism, maintaining the appearances, conducting the quiet restitution into the account she had opened in my name, fielding Graham's questions about money with the practiced vagueness of someone who has learned to answer without informing. 14 months of Sunday lunches and Thursday phone calls, and a summer that had presumably felt, to her, like standing on ground that was dissolving beneath her feet at a rate she could not control. I am not saying any of that excuses it. I want to be entirely clear about that, because I think it is important not to confuse understanding with absolution. What Vanessa had done had no justification. The fact that she had done it to protect Graham, the fact that she had begun the restitution, the fact that she was now sitting across from me with the visible weight of it on her, none of that changed what it was, and none of it gave anyone the right to ask me to minimize it. But understanding it changed how I sat with it. And sitting with it differently changed what I was able to do with the months that followed. Graham's session was the second one. He came alone, Chauvin had recommended separate initial sessions before any combined meeting, and I had agreed. He sat across from me, and he looked for the first time in my memory like what he actually was, a 51-year-old man who had made a serious wrong decision and who had spent the better part of a year being very careful not to examine it too closely. There were things in his face that I had not seen there before, a tiredness that was not the ordinary tiredness of a busy life, but the specific tiredness of someone who has been maintaining a version of themselves that does not correspond to the truth. He told me about Paul Street. He told me about Ciaran Donnelly and the investment that had seemed, when he first became involved, like a legitimate commercial opportunity, and that had become, gradually and then very quickly, something else entirely. He told me about the meeting in Cove with Oiv Kearney. Not everything that was said, but enough. He told me that he had known there was a private debt. He told me that he had not known specifically how Vanessa intended to address it. He told me he had chosen not to ask. That choosing, he said, was the thing he could not make peace with. Not the business failure, which was painful but recoverable. Not even the knowledge that Vanessa had done what she had done. But his own deliberate choice to remain precisely ignorant enough to be able, if it came to it, to say he had not known. The engineering of his own deniability. That was the thing that had been sitting in him since October, since Chauvin's letter had arrived and the deniability had immediately, quietly, collapsed. I listened to all of it. Then I asked him one question. I asked him whether, if Desmond had still been alive, he would have made the same choice. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said no. He said it without qualification, without softening, without the kind of contextual addendum that people attach to difficult admissions when they are not quite ready to make them cleanly. Just no, and I believed him. And believing him did not resolve anything, but it did something else. It gave me back a version of my son that I had been afraid, in the worst of those winter months, I might have permanently lost. If you have ever sat across from someone you love and watched them tell the truth about something they have been hiding, truly tell it without the protective scaffolding of justification, then you know what that moment does to the air in the room. It changes it, not into something easy or uncomplicated, but into something that can breathe, something that has the quality, however fragile, of an opening rather than a wall. The third session, the combined one, was the longest. It lasted nearly 4 hours. There were moments in it that I will carry for the rest of my life. Not because they were dramatic, they were not, but because they were the kind of moments that mark a permanent before and after in your understanding of the people you are in a room with. Vanessa spoke about things she had not said in the individual session. Graham heard things he had not heard before. I said things that I had written in the notebook and had not been certain, until I heard myself saying them aloud that I fully meant. Declan Ford was exceptional. He held that room with the quiet authority of someone who has spent years in the presence of complicated human situations, and who knows that his job is not to resolve them, but to create the conditions under which the people in them can resolve themselves. By the end of the third session, we had the framework of an agreement. Not a simple one, not a quick one, but a complete one. The restitution would be formalized, not through the account Vanessa had opened in my name, which was closed as part of the legal proceedings, but through a properly structured arrangement overseen by Chauvin and executed in transparent, documented installments over an agreed period. The Donnelly-Ford Company connections were formally severed. Our wife Kearney, who had attended the process only through her solicitor and had chosen not to be present in person, formally released all claims in exchange for conditions that I was not required to know in detail and that I chose, deliberately, not to inquire after. Patricia Hogan submitted her final report in June. It was thorough and precise, and it confirmed everything that had been established through the mediation, and I read it with the particular satisfaction of someone who finds that the numbers, in the end, have told the truth. Then I set it aside. Because by June I had something more pressing to attend to. I had begun looking at apartments. Siobhan had gently suggested at some point during the spring that it might be worth considering whether higher O'Connell Street still served me well. She had not pressed the point. It was a suggestion offered once and not repeated, which was her way. But it had lodged in me, and I had found myself, over the following weeks, looking at the house differently. Not with distaste. I had loved this house for 41 years, and love of that duration does not evaporate because the world around it has shifted. But with a new kind of assessment. The assessment of someone who has come through something difficult and who is now, perhaps for the first time in several years, genuinely thinking about what comes next rather than what has already passed. The apartment on Scilly Walk had been available since March. I had noticed it without intending to. Walking my usual morning route, seeing the estate agent's board outside a Georgian building whose upper floors I had always admired for the way they caught the light off the harbor. I had not gone in immediately. I had walked past it for 6 weeks, noting it each time, before I rang the number on the board. The apartment was on the first floor. It had 2 large windows that faced directly over the water. The morning light in those rooms was extraordinary, clear and moving, the light of a place that has the sea directly in front of it and nothing obstructing it. There was an original fireplace in the sitting room that had been restored rather than replaced, which told me something about the building's owners that I approved of. I made an offer in July. It was accepted. I moved in September, which is perhaps the loveliest month in Kinsale. The crowds of summer gone, the town returned to itself, the light going golden and low in the late afternoons, and the harbor glittering under it, in a way that never becomes ordinary, no matter how many years you have watched it. I furnished it simply. I brought Desmond's desk. I brought my files, my books, the dahlias bulbs from the garden, which I potted and placed on the windowsill where they would overwinter and come up again in the spring in the small raised beds the building's courtyard contained. I brought the lamp from the study and the mug I always held in both hands when I was thinking. The things that were mine, the things I had always known were mine, before the question of what belonged to me had become complicated and then, slowly, become clear again. The building had a small staff, a part-time caretaker for the structure, a woman who tended the common areas and the courtyard garden and who managed the maintenance schedules with quiet efficiency. I had seen her on my visits to view the apartment, always working, always neat, never idle. I had noted her without paying particular attention, the way you note the people who keep a place running well without necessarily registering their individual faces. It was a rainy afternoon in October, almost exactly a year after Ronan Kelleher had turned that bank screen toward me, when she knocked on my door. I opened it, and the face looking back at me from the corridor was Vanessa's. She was wearing the uniform of the building's maintenance company. Her hair was pulled back practically. She was thinner than she had been even at the mediation. She held a small clipboard, and she was looking at a point somewhere near my left shoulder, with the concentrated effort of someone who has prepared for a moment and is now, in the actual moment, discovering that preparation and experience are not the same thing. She said, "Good afternoon, ma'am." And I stood in my doorway looking at this woman who had signed a deed of arrangement without the funds to fulfill it, who had moved my retirement account into a rooting structure in the middle of the night, who had quietly opened an account in my name and begun the long work of putting back what she had taken, who had sat across from me in a room in Cork City and set down a weight she had been carrying for 14 months. I stood there looking at her, and I felt the entire history of it moving through the moment like weather moving through open water. I did not feel triumph. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Because I think there is an expectation, when a story reaches this kind of junction, that the person who has been wronged should feel something satisfying about the reversal of circumstances. Something clean and complete. I did not feel that. What I felt was more complicated and, I think, more true. What I felt was the particular weight of 2 people standing on either side of a door that is about to open onto something neither of them has entirely prepared for. I stepped back. I said, "Come in, Vanessa. I've just put the kettle on." She looked at me then, directly, for the first time since the mediation. And her face did something complicated that I will not attempt to describe precisely, because there are certain expressions that resist language in the same way that certain things resist being put into columns and balanced and resolved into a clean, final figure. She came inside. We sat at the table by the window that looked out over the harbor. The rain moved across the water in long gray curtains. The boats were barely visible. The light was the particular pewter and amber of Kinsale in autumn, and it fell across the table between us and across the tea things and across the hands of two women who had a great deal still to say to each other and who were, for the first time, genuinely ready to say it. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the money. That was managed, accounted for, on its way to resolution through the installments that arrived, without fail, on the first of each month into the account Siobhan now oversaw. Not about the mediation, not about Patricia's report, not about Graham, who was doing the slower and more private work of rebuilding what his choices had cost him in ways that were his own to manage. We talked about Desmond, about the last year of his life when Vanessa had been quietly indispensable in ways I had acknowledged only inadequately at the time, about what it had been like in the years after, the pressure that had built without an obvious release valve, the decisions that had compounded, the moment when a wrong choice had seemed, in the particular distortion of a desperate situation, like the only available one. She did not ask me to understand it. That was the thing that mattered most in that conversation. She did not ask me to understand it, or to forgive it, or to arrive at any particular conclusion about it. She spoke honestly, and she let the honesty sit there on the table between us without asking me to do anything with it except hear it. And I heard it. And I told her certain things about those winter months in the house on Higher O'Connell Street that I had not told anyone, not even Siobhan, not even in the notebook. Things about sitting at Desmond's desk in the dark with the lamp on and the harbor below, and the particular loneliness of a situation in which you have been very badly let down by people you love and cannot yet see the way through to whatever comes next. When she left, an hour before the light went entirely, she paused at the door. She did not say she was sorry. She had said that, fully and without qualification, at the mediation. Saying it again here would have been a lesser thing, a smaller version of the real thing, and I think she understood that. She said, "Thank you for the tea, Eleanor." It was the first time she had used my name. Not ma'am, not Mrs. Whitmore, which was how she had addressed me in the formal documentation. Eleanor, the name I had always had, the name Desmond had used, the name that belonged to the person I had been before any of this, and that I had carried through all of it, and that I intended to carry forward into whatever remained. I said good night. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway of my new apartment, with the harbor rain still moving past the windows and the lamp on in the sitting room beside Desmond's desk, and I took a breath that was, for the first time in a very long time, not weighted with anything that needed to be managed or resolved or examined or reconstructed into a ledger. Just a breath. I walked to the window and I looked out over the water, the pewter water, the amber lights of Kinsale reflected in it, the boats sitting still on the quiet harbor in the October dark. And I thought about what it means to lose something significant and to find, on the other side of the losing, that you are still entirely yourself. Still standing. Still holding the things that were always yours to hold. Still capable of making tea for someone who has wronged you because you have come to understand that justice and compassion are not opposites, that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and that the most difficult thing a person can do is not to hold on, but to decide, with full knowledge of everything that has happened, what it is worth carrying forward and what it is finally time to put down. I am 76 years old. I have lived in Kinsale for more than 40 years. I have loved a man who called this house breathing and planted dahlias in sections and read balance sheets like poetry and left me when he went, with the discipline and the instincts and the handwritten ledgers to find my way through the worst year of my life after his. I lost a great deal of money. I did not lose myself. And standing at that window in the October dark with the harbor below me and the lamp behind me and the tea things still on the table, where two women had finally spoken the truth to each other without the protection of legal process or professional language, I understood something that I think Desmond had always known and that I had always understood in my work, but had perhaps not fully understood in my life until now. Numbers tell you what happened. People tell you why. And why, when you are patient enough and honest enough and brave enough to listen to it, is always more complicated and more human and more recoverable than the numbers alone will ever show you. If this story has moved you, if somewhere in it you recognized something true about trust, about family, about the long and difficult work of rebuilding what has been broken, then leave a comment below and tell me what part of it stayed with you. I read every single one, and the conversations that happen in that comment section have become, over time, something I look forward to more than I can easily say. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do so now. There are more stories coming, stories about lives that have been tested and people who have found their way through, stories told honestly and with the kind of detail that only comes from having actually lived inside them. Subscribe so you do not miss a single one, because the next story is already waiting. And it begins, as the best ones always do, with something that looks, at first, like an ordinary morning.